Good morning. This is a live reading of the Left Behind series. We are on the second book, The Tribulation Force, and we are on chapter 12 today. And I will begin to read. As promised, Cardinal Matthew's assistant called Buck back, and the news was good. The Cardinal had been so impressed with Buck's interview of him for the soon-to-appear cover story that he said Buck could ride with him to New York the following morning. Buck booked the last flight out of O'Hare to Cincinnati that evening. He surprised Chloe by showing up at 6 with Chinese food. He told her of his plans for the evening trip and added, "I didn't want to waste talking time trying to find a place to eat. My dad's going to be jealous when he gets home," he said. She said, "He loves Chinese." Buck reached deep into the big sack, pulled out an extra order, and grinned. "Gotta keep the dad happy." Buck and Chloe sat in the kitchen eating and talking for more than an hour. They talked about everything, their respective childhoods, families, major events of their lives, hopes and fears and dreams. Buck loved to hear Chloe talk, not just what she said, but even her voice. He didn't know whether she was the best conversationalist he'd ever met, or if he was simply falling for her. Probably both, he decided. Rayford arrived to find Buck and Chloe at Ramey's computer, which had not been turned on since the week of the disappearances. Within a few minutes, Buck had Chloe connected to the internet and set up with a new email address. "Now from here, just like with your cell, you can reach me anywhere in the world." Rayford left Buck and Chloe at the computer and examined the mints from Holloman Meadows. The candies were still shrink-wrapped and had been delivered by a reputable company. They had been addressed to Chloe, but with no message. Rayford decided they had not been tampered with, and even if they had come from Hattie Durham for some inexplicable reason, there was no sense in not enjoying them. "Whoever's in love with your daughter sure has good taste," Buck said. "Thank you," Chloe said. "I mean good taste in chocolate mints." Chloe blushed. "I know what you meant," she said. At Rayford's insistence, Buck had agreed to leave his car in Steele's garage during his trip. Buck and Chloe left the Tribulation Force meeting early to get to the airport. Traffic was lighter than he expected, and they arrived more than 2 hours before his flight. "We could have stayed longer at the church," he said. "Better to be safe, though, don't you think?" she said. "I hate always running on the edge of lateness." "Me too," he said, "but I usually do. You can just drop me at the curb." "I don't mind waiting for you if you don't mind paying for the parking." "You're going to be all right going back to the car this time of night." "I've done it a lot of times," she said. "There are a lot of security guards." She parked and they strolled through the massive terminal. He lugged his leather over his shoulder case with his whole world in it. Chloe seemed awkward, but Buck had nothing for her to carry, and they weren't at the hand-holding stage yet, so they just kept moving. Every time he turned so she could hear him, his bag shifted and the strap slipped off his shoulder. So they eventually settled into a silent trek to the gate. Buck checked in and found that it was going to be a nearly empty flight. "Wish you could come with me," he said lightly. "I wish," she began, but apparently thought better of saying it. "What?" She shook her head. "You wish you could come with me too?" She nodded. "But I can't, and I won't, so let's not start with any of that." "What would I do with you?" he said. "Put you in my bag?" She laughed. They stood at the windows watching baggage handlers and ground traffic controllers in the night. Buck pretended to look out the window as he stared at Chloe's reflection, a few inches from his own. A couple of times he sensed her focus had shifted from the tarmac to the glass as well, and he imagined he was holding her gaze. Wishful thinking, he decided. "We're going to be delayed 20 minutes," the woman at the counter announced. "Don't feel obligated to stay, Chloe," Buck said. "You want me to walk you back to the car?" She laughed again. "You're really paranoid about that big old parking garage, aren't you?" "No. See, the deal is that I bring you here, wait with you and your gate, so you won't feel lonely, and then I stay until you're safely on the plane. I wave as it takes off, pretend to be rooted to the spot, and only when the jet trail fades out of sight do I venture out to the car. What? Do you make this stuff up as you go along? Of course. Now sit down and relax and pretend you're a frequent worldwide traveler. I wish for once I could pretend I'm not. And then you'd be nervous about the flight and need me here. I need you here anyway. She looked away. Slow down, he told himself. This was the fun part, the carring stage. But it was also maddeningly uncertain. He didn't want to say things to her just because he would be gone for a few days that he wouldn't say otherwise. I need you here too, she said lightly, but you're leaving me. That is something I would never do. What, leave me? Absolutely. He kept a humorous tone in an effort not to scare her off. Well, that's encouraging. Can't have any of this leaving stuff. Rayford kept an ear out for Chloe while packing for his quick trip to New York the next afternoon. Earl had called wanting to know if Carpathia's office had reached him. And is that the same Hattie Durham who used to work for us? Earl asked. One and the same. She's Carpathia's secretary? Something like that. Small world. I guess it would be silly to tell you to be careful in Cincinnati and New York and Israel, considering all you've been through, Chloe said. Buck smiled. Don't start your goodbyes until you're ready to leave. I'm not leaving till your plane is out of sight, she said. I told you that. We have time for a cookie, he said, pointing at a vendor in the corridor. We already had dessert, she said. Chocolates and a cookie. Fortune cookies don't count, he said. Come on, don't you remember our first cookie? The day they had met, Chloe had eaten a cookie, and he had dabbed a tiny piece of chocolate from the corner of her mouth with his thumb. Not knowing what to do with it, he had licked it off. I remember I was a slob, she said, and you tried a very old joke. You feel like a cookie, he said, setting her up the way she had him in New York that first day. Why, do I look like one? Buck laughed, not because the joke was any funnier the first time, he decided, but because it was theirs and it was stupid. I'm really not hungry, she said as they peered through the glass as a bored teenager waiting for their order. Me either, Buck said. These are for later. Tonight later or tomorrow later, she asked. Whenever we synchronize our watches. We're going to eat them together. I mean at the same time. Doesn't that sound exciting? Your creativity never ceases. Buck ordered 2 cookies and 2 bags. Can't do that, the teenager said. Then I want 1 cookie, he said, handing over the money and slipping some to Chloe. And I want 1 cookie, she said, money in hand. The teenager made a face, bagged the cookies for each of them, and made change. More than one way to skin a cat, Buck said. They moseyed back to the gate. A few more passengers had gathered, and the woman at the counter announced that their plane had finally arrived. Buck and Chloe sat watching as the arriving passengers filed past looking tired. Buck carefully folded his cookie sack and laid it in his carry-on bag. I'll be on a plane to New York at 8 tomorrow morning, he said. I'll have this with coffee and think of you. That'll be 7 o'clock my time, Chloe said. I'll still be in bed, anticipating my cookie and dreaming of you. We're still playing around the edges, Buck thought. Neither of us will say anything serious. I'll wait till you're up then, he said. Tell me when you're going to eat your cookie. Chloe studied the ceiling. When will you be in your most important, most formal meeting? Probably sometime late morning at a big hotel in New York. Carpathia is coming for some joint announcements with Cardinal Matthews and other religious leaders. Whenever that is, I'll eat my cookie, Chloe said, and I dare you to eat yours then too. You'll learn not to dare me, Buck smiled, but he was only half kidding. I know no fear. Ha, she said, you're afraid of the parking garage here, and you're not even the one walking through it alone. Buck reached for her cookie sack. What are you doing? She said. We're not hungry, remember? Just smell this, he said. Fragrance is such a memory enhancer. He opened her cookie sack and held it up to his face. He said, cookie dough, chocolate, nuts, butter, you name it. He tilted it toward her, and she leaned to sniff it. I do love that smell, she said. Buck reached with his other hand and cupped her cheek in his palm. She didn't pull away, but held his look. Remember this moment, he said. I'll be thinking of you while I'm gone. Me too, she said. Now close that bag. That cookie has to stay fresh so the smell will remind me. Rayford awoke earlier than Chloe and padded down to the kitchen. He lifted the small cookie bag from the counter. One left, he thought, and was tempted. Instead, he wrote Chloe a note. Hope you don't mind, I couldn't resist. On the back, he wrote, just kidding, and laid the note atop the bag. He had coffee and juice, then changed into his workout clothes and went for a run. Well, Buck sat in first class with Cardinal Matthews on the Cincy to New York morning flight. Matthews was in his late 50s, a beefy, jowly man with close-cropped black hair that appeared to be his own natural color. Only his collar evidenced his station. He carried an expensive briefcase and laptop computer, and Buck noticed from his ticket sleeve that he had checked 4 bags. Matthews traveled with an aide who merely deflected other people and said little. The aide moved to a seat in front of them so Buck could sit next to the Archbishop. Why didn't you tell me you were a candidate for the papacy? Buck began. So we're just going to jump right into it, are we? Matthews said. Don't you like a little champagne in the morning? No, thanks. Well, you won't mind if I have a little pick-me-up. Suit yourself. Tell me when you're available to chat. Matthew's aide heard the conversation and signaled the flight attendant, who immediately brought the Cardinal a glass of champagne. The usual, she said. Thank you, Karen, he said, as if an old friend. Apparently she was. When she was gone, he whispered, the light whiskey family, from my first parish. Baptized her myself. She's worked this flight for years. Now, where were we? Buck did not respond. He knew the Cardinal had heard and remembered the question. If he wanted it repeated for his own ego, he could repeat it himself. Oh, yes, you were wondering why I didn't mention the papacy. I guess I thought everyone knew. Carpathia knew. I'll bet he did, Buck thought. Probably engineered it. Is Carpathia hoping you'll get it? Off the record, Matthew whispered. There is no hoping anymore. We have the votes. We? That's the editorial we. We, us, me, I have the votes. Understand? How can you be so sure? I've been a member of the College of Cardinals for more than 10 years. I have never yet been surprised by a papal vote. You know what Nikolai calls me? He calls me PM. Buck shrugged. He calls you by your initials? Is there some significance? Matthew's aide peeked back between the seats and shook his head. So I should know, Buck surmised, but he had never been afraid of asking a dumb question. Pontifex Maximus, Matthews beamed, Supreme Pope. Congratulations, Buck said. Thank you, but I trust you know that Nikolai has much more in mind for my papacy than merely leadership of the Holy Roman Catholic Mother Church. Tell me. It'll be announced later this morning, and if you do not quote me directly, I'll give you the first shot at it. Why would you do that? Because I like you. You hardly know me. But I know Nikolai. Oh, Buck sank in his seat, and Nikolai likes me. Exactly. So this little ride-along was not really entirely the result of my legwork. Oh, no, Matthew said. Carpathia endorsed you. He wants me to tell you everything. Just don't make me look bad or self-serving for what I tell you. Will the announcement make you appear that way? No, because Carpathia himself will make that announcement. I'm listening. Secretary General Carpathia's office. Miss Durham speaking. Rayford's still here. Rayford, how are... Let me get to the point, Hattie. I want to come early this afternoon so I can speak with you privately for a few minutes. That would be wonderful, Captain Steele. I should tell you in advance, however, that I am seeing someone. That's not funny. I didn't intend it to be. Will you have time? Certainly. Secretary General Carpathia can see you at 4. Shall I look for you at 3:30? Rayford hung up the phone as Chloe came into the kitchen, dressed for work at the church. She saw his note. Oh, Dad, you didn't, she said, and he thought she was on the verge of tears. She grabbed the bag and shook it. A relieved look came over her as she turned the note over and laughed. Grow up, Dad. For once in your life, act your age. He was getting ready to head to the airport, and she for work, when CNN broadcast a press conference live from the meeting of international religious leaders in New York. Watch this, Dad, she said. Buck is there. Rayford set his carry-on bag on the floor and went to stand next to Chloe, who held a mug of coffee in both hands. The CNN correspondent intoned an explanation of what was to come. We're expecting a joint statement from the coalition of religious leaders in the United Nations. Represented by new Secretary General Nikolai Carpathia, he seems the man of the hour here, having helped hammer out propositions and pulling together representatives of widely varying systems of belief. Since he has been in office, not a day has passed without some major development. Speculation here is that the religions of the world are going to make some fresh attempt at addressing global issues in a more cohesive and tolerant way than ever before. It has failed in the past, but we'll soon see if this time around there is some new wrinkle that can finally make it work. Stepping to the podium is Archbishop Peter Cardinal Matthews, prelate of the Cincinnati Archdiocese of the Roman Catholic Church and widely seen as a potential successor to Pope John the 24th, who served only a controversial 5 months before being listed among the missing in the disappearances just weeks ago. The camera panned to the press conference platform, where more than 24 religious leaders from around the world, all dressed in their native garb, jockeyed for position. As Archbishop Matthews worked his way through to the bank of microphones, Rayford heard Chloe squeal, "There's Buck, Dad, look, right there." She pointed to a reporter who was not in the crowd with the rest of the journalists, but seemed to teeter on the back edge of the raised platform. Buck appeared to be trying to keep his balance. Twice he stepped down only to step back up again. As Matthews droned on about international cooperation, Rayford and Chloe stared at Buck in the back corner. No one else would have even noticed him. "What's he got?" Rayford said. "Is that some sort of a notebook or recorder?" Chloe looked close and gasped. She ran to the kitchen and returned with her cookie set. "It's his cookies," she said. "We're going to eat our cookies at the same time." Rayford was lost, but he was sure glad he hadn't eaten that cookie. "What?" he began, but Chloe shushed him. "It smells just like last night," she said. Rayford snorted. "Just what did last night smell like?" he said. "Shh." And sure enough, as they watched Buck quickly and quietly reach into his little sack and almost invisibly slid out the cookie, put it into his mouth, and took a bite. Chloe matched him gesture for gesture, and Rayford noticed she was smiling and crying at the same time. "You got it bad," he said, and he left for the airport. Buck had no idea whether his little antic had been seen by anyone, let alone Chloe Steele. What was this girl doing to him? He had somehow gone from international star journalist to love-struck romantic doing silly things for attention. But he hoped not too much attention. Few people ever noticed anyone on the edge of the TV shot. For all he knew, Chloe could have been watching and not have seen him at all. Most important in his efforts was the major story that broke from what might otherwise have been labeled a typical international confab. Somehow Nikolai Carpathia, either by promising support for Matthew's papacy or by his uncanny ability to charm anyone, had gotten these religious leaders to produce a proposition of incredible significance. They were announcing not only an effort to cooperate and be more tolerant of each other, but also the formation of an entirely new religion, one that would incorporate the tenets of all. At least that sounded impossible to the devout members of each of our sects, Matthew said. "We are all, every one of us, in total unanimity. Our religions themselves have caused as much division and bloodshed around the world as any government, army, or weapon. From this day forward, we will unite under the banner of the global community faith. Our logo will contain sacred symbols from religions that represent all, and from here on will encompass all. Whether we believe God is a real person or merely a concept, God is in all and above all and around all. God is in us. God is us. We are God." When the floor was open to questions, many astute religious editors zeroed in. "What happens to the leadership of, say, Roman Catholicism? Will there be the need for a pope?" "We will elect a pope," Matthew said, "and we expect that other major religions will continue to appoint leaders in their usual cycles. But these leaders will serve the global community faith and be expected to maintain the loyalty and devotion of their parishioners to the larger cause. Is there one major tenet you all agree on?" This was met with laughter by the participants. Matthews called on a Rastafarian to answer. Through an interpreter, he said, "We believe two things concretely. First, in the basic goodness of humankind. Second, that the disappearances were a religious cleansing. Some religions saw many disappear, others saw very few, many saw none. But the fact that many were left from each proves that none was better than the other. We will be tolerant of all, believing that the best of us remain." Buck moved around to the front and raised his hand. "Cameron Williams, Global Weekly," he said. Follow-up question for the gentleman at the microphone, or Matthews or whomever. How does this tenet of the basic goodness of humankind jibe with the idea that the bad people have been windowed out? How did they miss possessing this basic goodness? No one moved to answer. The Rastafarian looked to Matthews, who stared blankly at Buck, clearly not wishing to act upset, but also wanting to communicate that he felt ambushed. Matthews finally took the microphone. "We are not here to debate theology," he said. "I happen to be one of these who believes that the disappearances constituted a cleansing, and that the basic goodness of humankind is the common denominator of those who remain. And this basic goodness is found in a greater measure in no one other than United Nations Secretary General Nicolae Carpathia. Welcome him, please." The platform erupted with religious leaders cheering. Some of the press clapped, and for the first time Buck became aware of a huge public contingent behind the press. Due to the spotlights, he had not seen them from the platform, and he had not heard them until Carpathia appeared. Carpathia was his typical masterful self, giving all the credit to the leadership and endorsing this historic, perfect idea whose time is long overdue. He took a few questions, including what would happen to the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That, I am happy to say, will proceed. As many of you know, which money has been donated to this cause for decades, and some prefabrication of the temple and other sites has been underway for years. Once the reconstruction begins, completion should be without delay. But what happens to the Islamic Dome of the Rock? "I am so glad you asked that question," Carpathia said, and Buck wondered if he hadn't planted it. "Our Muslim brothers have agreed to move not only the shrine, but also the sacred section of the rock to New Babylon, freeing the Jews to rebuild their temple on what they believe is the original site. And now, if you will indulge me for a moment longer, I would like to say that we clearly are the most momentous juncture in world history. With the consolidation to one form of currency, with the cooperation and toleration of many religions into one, with worldwide disarmament and commitment to peace, the world is truly becoming one. Many of you have heard me use the term global community. This is a worthy name for our new cause. We can communicate with one another, worship with one another, trade with one another. With communications and travel advancements, we are no longer a conglomeration of countries and nations, but one complete global community, a village made up of equal citizens. I thank the leaders here who have assembled this piece of this beautiful mosaic, and would like to make an announcement in their honor. With the move of the United Nations headquarters to New Babylon will come a new name for our great organization. We will become known as a global community. When applause finally subsided, Carpathia concluded. Thus, the name of the new one world religion, global community faith, is precisely appropriate. Carpathia was being whisked away as camera and sound crews began tearing down the press conference site. Nicolae saw Buck and broke stride, telling his bodyguards he wanted to talk with someone. They formed a human wall around him as Carpathia embraced Buck. It was all Buck could do to not recoil. "Be careful of what you're doing to my journalistic independence," he whispered in Carpathia's ear. "Any good news for me yet?" Carpathia asked, holding Buck at arm's length and looking into his eyes. "Not yet, sir. I will see you in Jerusalem?" "Of course." "You will keep in touch with Steve?" "I will." "You tell him what it will take, and we will do it. That is a promise." Buck sidled over to a small group where Peter Matthews was holding court. Buck waited until the Archbishop noticed him. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "What did I miss?" "What do you mean? You were there. You said Carpathia would make some announcement about an expanded role for the next pope, something bigger and more important even than the Catholic Church." Matthew stood shaking his head. "Perhaps I had you overrated, friend. I am not the pope yet, but couldn't you tell from the Secretary General's statement that there will be need for a head of a new religion? What better place to headquarter it than the Vatican? And who better to lead it than the new pope? So you'll be the Pope of Popes?" Matthew smiled and nodded. "PM," he said. 2 hours later, Rayford Steele arrived at the United Nations. He had been praying silently since he phoned Bruce Barnes just before he boarded his flight. "I feel like I'm going to meet the devil," Rayford said. "Not much in the life scares me, Bruce. I've always taken pride in that, but I've got to tell you, this is awful." "First, Rayford, only if you were encountering the Antichrist in the second half of the tribulation would you actually be dealing with the person who is possessed by Satan himself." "So what is Carpathia? Some second-rate demon?" "No, you need prayer support. You know what happened in Buck's presence." "Buck is 10 years younger and in better shape," Rayford said. "I feel as if I'll fall apart in there." "You won't. Stay strong. God knows where you are, and he has perfect timing. I'll be praying, and you know Chloe and Buck will be too." That was a great comfort to Rayford, and it was particularly encouraging to know that Buck was in town. Just knowing he was in close proximity made Rayford feel less alone. Yet in his anxiety over meeting Carpathia face to face, he did not want to look past the ordeal of confronting Hattie Durham. Hattie was waiting when he stepped off the elevator. He had hoped to have a moment to get the lay of the land, to freshen up, to take a deep breath. But there she stood in all her youthful beauty, more stunning than ever because of a tan and expensively tailored clothes on a frame that needed no help. He did not expect what he saw, and he sensed evil in the place when a flash of longing for her briefly invaded his mind. Rayford's old nature immediately reminded him why she had distracted him during a wintry season of his marriage. He prayed silently, thanking God for sparing him from having done something he would have regretted forever. And as soon as Hattie opened her mouth, he was brought back to reality. Her diction and articulation were more refined, but this was still a woman without a clue, and he could hear it in her tone. "Captain Steele," she gushed, "how wonderful to see you again. How is everyone else?" "Everyone else? You know, Chloe and Buck and everybody." Chloe and Buck are everybody, he thought, but he didn't say so. "Everybody's fine." "Oh, that's wonderful. Is there a private place we can talk?" She led him to her work area, which was disconcertingly open. No one was around to overhear them, but the ceilings were at least 20 feet high. Her desk and tables and file cabinets were set in a cavernous area which like a railroad station with no confining walls. Footsteps echoed, and Rayford had the distinct impression that they were a long way from the offices of the Secretary General. "So what's new with you since I saw you last, Captain Steele?" "Hattie, I don't want to be unkind, but you can stop with the Captain Steele and the pretending to not know what's new. What's new is that you and your new boss have invaded my job and my family, and I seem powerless to do anything about it." And that is the end of chapter 12. Next, we'll be reading chapter 13. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and you're free to go.